In this video, we want to start the process of dissecting that first tiny application that we created in the previous video. I want to spend a few moments and look at every single line of code in that program.cs file that we were just working on as a basis for further exploration in C#. So first of all, let's go through a little review before we get started. In the previous video, we wrote code in an area between two curly braces that was executed whenever we ran our application. The code did two things. First, it printed a text statement in the Windows console, and then second, it caused the application to pause for just a moment, waiting for input before it would continue on. And then secondly, we ran the application by using that little green triangle button, the Start Debugging button. So let's do this. Let's start from the inside of that code block and work our way outward, because there's a lot of text, and I want to take the opportunity now to explain as much as I can, at least at this early stage, about what all those words and all those symbols and things of that nature, what they actually mean, what do they do for you. So let's start by taking a look at this word console, which is the very first thing that we typed in. What is it about this word console? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to take our first deep dive. And to quote Morpheus from my favorite movie, The Matrix, you take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And so you just swallowed the red pill, whether you realize it or not. So here we go. When you learn how to write applications with C#, the syntax of C#, or rather the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language, is half the battle. The other half is learning about the .NET framework. And I said in the installation video that the .NET framework is a protective bubble that your application lives inside of. And what I mean by that is this. When you write code, the .NET framework makes your job a lot easier in a couple of very important ways. First of all, your code runs inside of the .NET Framework runtime, which is an application that wraps around your application. The runtime takes care of things, low-level details, things like managing how the data in your application is moved into and out of memory. Similar functionality. It prevents your application from accidentally crashing somebody else's computer. And then it also does the following. It provides a library of functionality, so your code can make use of a library of code that's been written by Microsoft to take care of low-level details like displaying data to the screen, or moving data from one computer to another, or working with dates and times, or the down and dirty details of opening up files and reading them and writing them, and so on. So as a result, you get to focus on the important stuff as a programmer, the real value or the purpose of your application. So this library of functionality is called the .NET Framework Class Library, or the FCL. Some books refer to it as the Base Class Library, or the BCL. And I might accidentally use those terms interchangeably, but it's the exact same thing. It's that library of code that Microsoft makes available. So for right now, it's the .NET Framework Class Library that I want to focus on for the remainder of this video. When we type the word console.writeLine into our application, we were using some code in the library that knows how to write a line of text to the Windows console. All we have to do is just tell it what text we actually want displayed, or we get to focus on just the important part. We don't care how it writes the text, or we just really care that the text actually gets displayed into the window. So the console part of that console.writeLine, the console part is called a class. The writeLine part is called a method. The method writeLine is the part that does all of the hard work. For right now, you can just think of the class part, the console part, as a way of organizing code. Now, soon we're going to expand that definition of what a class is, but for the moment, let's just use that as a working definition. I think it'll serve us well for a day or two. So the console class has another method that's called readLine. And so Microsoft has gathered all the code together that deals with the Windows console, and it organizes them into a class called console. So later on, we're going to be writing our own classes and our own methods, creating our own libraries to organize our code. Again, we'll even expand on that definition to give it a broader definition, but let's come back to that. Okay, so the WriteLine method allows us to tell it what we want to write to the console window, and this is called a method parameter. Some methods accept no parameters. The console.readLine, we did not send any parameters into that method. However, with WriteLine, we told it we wanted it to write a string hello world into the console window. So we passed a parameter. Some methods can accept virtually infinite number of parameters. We'll talk about that later. So you can see what I mean by parameters because it uses parentheses to define parameters. In the case of WriteLine, we have between parameters the argument hello world, and then between the readLine method we have open and close parentheses with nothing in between. That means it doesn't accept any parameters. So just a quick side note that we'll come back to just in a moment here. When we passed in the words hello world, we surrounded them with double quotation marks. So what happens if we were to remove these? Let's just have a little fun here for a moment, and we were to remove them. And notice what happens here. We get some red squiggly lines underneath of our of both words, and we try to run the application. We get an error, and if we took a look at the error list, it would just throw a plethora of problems at us, saying you got to fix all this. The double quotes tell C# that we're passing in what's called a literal string. In other words, we want literally those exact words to be displayed. As opposed to what, you might ask? Well, I'll answer that later today when we talk about variables. Since it doesn't really understand what we're getting at here, it tells us that we have a problem by virtue of the fact that it gives those red squiggly lines and all the error messages in the error list. We got to fix that, and I just did that. Okay, we'll come back to that. That was just a sidebar. All right, so moving away from that and back to the topic at hand, methods. Let's take a look at another method, the main method. And in this case, this is where we wrote the code. You can see static void main. Here we're calling a method. Here we are defining what goes inside of a method. Okay, so a method is a block of code that has a name. This squiggly lines here, these little squiggly braces, they define a code block, and in this case they demonstrate containment, meaning that the code block owns this code block. Whatever's inside of there, it owns that. And then we gave that code block a name called main. So since it has a name, it can be called, and I'm going to show you how, and more importantly why you would create your own methods later on in the week. We'll come back to that in just a moment. In the case of a simple console application, by default, the main method is the first method that's called, or rather executed. So notice that this main method defines a parameter. Here we're passing in a parameter that's to a method that's already been defined in the base class library or the framework class library. Here we're defining how a parameter for main, what it should look like. And let's table that discussion for another video whenever we get a chance to talk about methods and creating your own. I assure you it'll make a lot more sense later on.